Right now, we have a very interesting situation developing in Golden State with Klay Thompson with a possible extension for him. The fact that Golden State and him have not agreed to an extension. I think this has a lot of consequences, not only for the Warriors' upcoming season, but also potentially for what could be the end of an era in Golden State. Now, this is a really difficult conversation to have if you're a Warriors fan or if you're, one of these people trying to make this decision, because Klay Thompson is still good. This isn't someone that is completely washed. This isn't someone that's like not even a starting caliber player anymore. If Klay Thompson goes to free agency, there are going to be teams that are going to want to sign him. And that's a difficult equation for Golden State right now, because in a vacuum, they would love to have Klay Thompson come back on a fair deal. I think they still desperately want him to be on the team. I think they still see the value that he brings to the team. Obviously, he's like a franchise cornerstone for them. At this point, that combination of him and Steph is something that's going to live on with the franchise's history forever. But the issue at the moment is that Klay still views himself as this potentially like $40 million a year player. Even maybe in his own mind, he views himself as like a max caliber player. I'm not really sure. But clearly, there's a disconnect in terms of what Golden State accurately believes Klay Thompson's value is and where Klay Thompson thinks that he is. He's always been someone that has spoken publicly about how he views himself in terms of the hierarchy of the league, especially in terms of how much the Warriors have won since he's been there. And it's just a difficult equation for them to figure out right now, because they could theoretically just decide, you know what, we're going to bring Klay back. We're going to re-sign him to a 3-year deal worth $40 million a year. And yes, that's a lot of money, but at least we get to keep Klay Thompson. But there've already been moves and there's already been signs that that's not something that they would be excited about doing. One, obviously the fact they've been signing the extension, but also when you look at how they've continued to structure their payroll, they basically just dumped James Wiseman last year to save some money on the luxury tax. Now, granted, it saved them a ton of money, and I don't think Wiseman was going to do anything for them eventually, but in a different circumstance, we've seen Golden State in the past hold on to guys like that for a little bit longer than they held on to Wiseman, because they weren't really that worried about the money, but the payroll got into such a crazy extent for them that they just kind of had to make that decision. And then, of course, this offseason, they had a similar situation to what they're facing right now with Klay, where they were trying to figure out how they were going to be able to bring back Draymond Green, and they wanted to prioritize bringing him back. They didn't want to lose him. They still saw his value as a defensive player, and so they brought him back. It was a pretty fair deal, 4 years, $100 million, but they dumped Jordan Poole in what is a salary dump. Yes, they brought in Chris Paul, who makes the same amount Jordan Poole does this year, but it's an expiring contract, and it gets them out of that contract in the future. And they did that deal with the Draymond contract in mind, and I think possibly with the Klay situation in mind as well. And once you start to look at how the payroll really, shakes out for Golden State after this season, a $40 million a year Klay Thompson contract is pretty difficult to figure out where that goes in there when you think about Steph and Wiggins and Draymond, and then Klay on top of that as well. It's just a really difficult decision, because this is the worst case scenario of a team having a guy that means a lot to their franchise, that thinks he's worth a lot of money, that is worth a lot, but not as much as he thinks that he is, and not wanting to upset your fan base or to end this era, but also not wanting to get yourself in a bad contract. And there's almost a no-win situation here for Golden State. Now, to be honest, at this point last year, I kind of felt the same way about the Draymond Green situation that I do about the Klay Thompson situation right now, which is that it feels kind of unlikely that they would be returning to the team. Obviously, this time last year, we were dealing with the Draymond punch of Jordan Poole, and I thought that maybe that was going to be kind of the point of separation for him and the team, in addition to him wanting a ton of salary just to be able to stay in Golden State. And ultimately, they were able to work that out. But there is no other cost-cutting move here that makes sense, that actually semi-helps their roster the way that the Poole-Chris Paul trade did. That move doesn't exist if you also want to bring back Klay. Now, ultimately, I think Draymond kind of came around to the idea of taking a little bit less money. I'm sure there were teams out there that would have at least given him the equivalent amount to what Golden State did. I'm sure that there was a team out there that might have offered him $30 million a year, but he understood that he still has a chance to win a ton in Golden State. It's the only place that he's ever played, and there's obviously some loyalty there, and it's a place that he wants to be. He wants to still play with Steph. He wants to still play with Klay. He still wants to be there. And I think the hope right now is Golden State can look at that Draymond situation last year and look at this Klay situation this year and realize, you know what, there is a path here to getting this figured out. And even though it feels tenuous now, just like it felt tenuous with Draymond last offseason, that there is a path here, that Klay realizes what his true value is, that you bring him back on a deal that's maybe $30 million a year for 3 years, whatever the case may be. And he understands that he's not going to get, max contract value from Golden State or anywhere else. But the The alternate situation and scenario there is really interesting to me. What does it look like if they can't get the extension figured out? They go to the offseason, Klay becomes a free agent, and he actually ends up leaving. What does that look like for Golden State? How much does it actually hurt them? And what does Klay's new contract look like? Because again, I think there are teams out there that still value someone that is still at times one of the best shooters in the league. He slips defensively, athletically, all these different things because of the injury issues, and really that has been the problem for him. I think if Klay never got hurt the way that he did, I'm sure he'd still be just as good as he was before the injuries. Golden State would be willing to continue to bring him back on whatever deal he wanted, and they would keep the Splash Brothers thing together. But I still think there are plenty of teams around the league that would be willing to offer Klay a significant amount in free agency. And if that does happen and he goes somewhere else, that's just a really difficult thing to reconcile with if you're Golden State, because not only would you lose him, but depending on how the Chris Paul thing goes this year, you could also lose Chris Paul to free agency. And yes, you save yourself some money, but you don't save yourself enough money to suddenly have, cap space to spend and go out and replace those guys. And you're making yourself actively worse in what could be the last few years of a really good Steph Curry seasons, with the idea being that you just didn't want to pay a ton of money to, whether it be Paul or more specifically in this situation, Klay Thompson. And that's never something that Golden State has ever done. Like from the moment that everything started working out between Steph and Klay and Draymond and they started contending, from that moment they realized how special that group was. They always pushed their chips into the middle of the table. They went and got KD. They flipped that around to D'Lo. They got Wiggins. Yes, they went through kind of the youth movement and tried to have Kuminga and Moody and Wiseman and all these guys develop, and it didn't work out. But they always, tried to push. They never tried to save money up until recently, right? The Jordan Poole contract salary dump, the Wiseman salary dump. And I'm wondering if Golden State themselves even are starting to realize that this could be it for them. This year could be the final year. Yes, they won the title 2 years ago. Yes, they're still one of the better teams in the Western Conference when they're right, when they're healthy. Their playoff record together with Draymond, Steve Kerr, Klay Thompson, and Steph Curry is insane. It's out of control. But it doesn't make sense anymore to pay Klay a ton of money. It wouldn't make sense to bring back Chris Paul. They brought back Draymond on a lower number, and Steph is still going to be there. But this version of Warriors basketball, this could be it. This could be the end of this era. And it's a really interesting thing to think about because these guys have seemed to age so well together, even through injuries, even through a decrease in offensive production from Draymond. They've still managed to make it work, and of course winning the title 2 seasons ago. But the idea of money essentially being the reason that this era of Warriors basketball is over would be a really, really interesting concept. Now, they could still fix it. They could win the title this year. They could make the finals this year. They could bring back Klay and decide, you know what? We don't care if the last couple years of Draymond and Klay's contracts aren't very good. We still have a window here, and we still want to do everything we can to try and win with Steph, which has been kind of their motivation this whole time anyway. That's definitely still a possibility. But just like it felt like last offseason, the Draymond situation was maybe the beginning of the end with this era. I think it's almost even more concerning now with Klay because he's definitely more expendable than Draymond was, which could lead him to actually leaving and not being a Golden State Warrior next year.